Okay, good evening. Welcome to the latest, the Tolpuddle Radical History School. When I signed up for this 12, 13, 14 years ago, I didn't ever expect that we'd be doing evening sessions throughout the winter. And that's just one of the surprising turns that life takes on you. It's my great pleasure tonight to Rachel Holmes. Rachel's already spoken at Tolpuddle a couple of times. She's a regular at the Radical History School. She wrote a great book about Eleanor Marx, and she's now written a fantastic book about Sylvia Pankhurst. And I'm really sure that you're going to enjoy what she's got to say tonight. I'm going to hand over to Rachel. As Nigel just said, if you've got, please put them in the question and answer session box at the bottom of your screen, and we will deal with those at the end of the session. I'll be keeping an eye on the chat, and I'll be back. Well, I'll be on screen all the time, but I'll be muting myself. But I will be keeping an eye on the question and answer box, so I'll know. It's my great pleasure to introduce Rachel Holmes, who's Sylvia Pankhurst. Rachel, over to you.
Thank you, Les. Thank you, Nigel. And thank you. It's great to be back at the history school and to be doing Tolpuddle in the very novel situation of being inside and dry and not in the driving rain. But I hope we'll be back. Well, I hope we'll be back to normality next year. And thank you very much to the TUC for hosting this. My book about Sylvia Pankhurst, my biography, Natural Born Rebel, which has just been published, is a story that covers the arc of Sylvia Pankhurst's life and all the decades thereof. But this talk this evening, our conversation, is not about the whole arc of her life. It's really to focus, to think and reflect on a grid which is about her skill set as an activist and the ways in which I think her legacy, and I think we can agree her legacy, is really useful and instructive for us today in difficult times. Nigel's very kindly going to be presenting a series of images. I should tell you that they're just to give you, they roughly follow the themes that I'm talking about, but I'm not going to be speaking to the individual images. I'm not an art historian, and they're just sort of generally so that you can sort of immerse yourself and be in the presence of Sylvia Pankhurst. I also find doing online lectures a little bit like being in a hostage video. So for me, I feel happier if I know that you're looking at images of Sylvia. So for a while to discuss the Pankhurst sister, who I think in this audience and in this group probably is the one I don't have to explain, is the red suffragette, the red Pankhurst, the socialist Sylvia, not her older mother, who wanted votes mainly just for posh women, not her sister, who wanted to be a lawyer, but Sylvia Pankhurst, born in Manchester, as we know, in 1882, the middle sister, not the younger sister Adela, who went to Australia, but the sister who wanted to be an artist, because that is what by disposition she was. And that is my, if you like, my first skill set that I want to look at in terms of her being an activist. She was always a talented artist. And just before we begin, there's that picture of her there as the young militant suffragette. I think she looks very much like a lot of young women today. That hairstyle is particularly fashionable at the moment. But I hope that we can talk about these skills, which there's the later picture of her, the very famous, wonderful Costa portrait. But from her youth to her maturity, these are the skill sets that she carries through. And as an artist, she was someone who was centered on creativity. She was a visionary and very visual, but also visionary and full of imagination. And that could well have been her life. She was immensely talented in a different world, born to a different family. If she was a different person, that motivation and those skills could have been what she did, and indeed what she set out thinking she would do. She was painting and drawing from a young age, and this was an exceptional talent. She won not one but 2 scholarships to really majorly important art schools, the wonderful radical Manchester Art School, and then later to the Royal College of Art. And it was a rare thing particularly to get a national scholarship as a young woman, never mind win a national scholarship at all. And this is what really she felt her passion would do. But she wasn't able to devote her life to fine art and painting. And instead, she became the artist of the suffragette campaign. There's some moments that I found very striking when I was reading her correspondence and reading discussions that she had with some of her fellow students, women students, sexual dissidents, people committed to self-expression, but as much as they supported ideas about women's rights or emancipation for themselves and their own needs, it never occurred to them that they would give up art in order to pursue the politics, in order to be an activist. And conversely, Sylvia could never understand why they didn't understand that she had no choice. And some of those conversations are quite interesting, and I think that defines her all along, that she felt that this was her principled volition, that she was guided and driven by this. So she becomes the artist instead of the suffragette campaign initially, and she makes banners, and she energizes and illuminates and makes sort of visual pageantry. For example, sort of hundreds and thousands of liberty caps, votes for women banners, which are handmade and reproduced, designing medals for hunger strikers that they're awarded when they come out of prison, suffragette hunger strikers, for having served and having survived that. She does festival installations, she makes placards and banners, and she's very visual in all her campaigning, using colour and iconography drawn from all different parts of British folk culture, from Coptic art going, that you can find indeed in Ethiopia, of course, later in her life, but much earlier in Egypt. She kind of did the t-shirts before there were t-shirts. She got the branding, and she conjured the imagery of the suffragette campaign, and that was how she put that skill set to use. But she believed in the search for beauty. She talks about how when she used to go with her father when she was young to meetings, above stables, and they were all in, it was really dreary, and it was a bit sort of cold and dark, and there wasn't much to sort of inspire people. And so she loved the idea of forms of art and culture that were part of the point of striving for freedom. All forms of art, visual, dance, music, and as I've said, folk culture. And in this regard, we can only imagine what she would have made with the internet and digital visual culture as her toy box, being able to use photographs, pictures, that so often can speak louder than words. She was in an age before easy forms of mechanical reproduction or access to it. Things had to be hand produced, and indeed often when she was producing materials, she would rope in some of her fellow students that she'd been to art school with, and they would sit up nights and days producing all sorts of things to be used for demonstrations, to be used for installations. And I think that we can imagine how she might be very excited, but can also remind us of the opportunities that we have in terms of being able to use art and music and culture as an activist tool. I think the next thing that we think of Sylvia Pankhurst as and central to her campaigning is as an activist skill, and is her use of her skill of writing, of her literacy, of her ability to read and write, and such education as she had. I think she is very fundamentally defined. Certainly that's a central theme of my book, about the art of campaigning through writing. She's a writer, a prolific writer, a political essayist, an editor, a journalist, a memorialist. She writes poetry, she writes unfinished and finished plays. She has a novel that's constantly in process, never published, but very near finished and successively redrafted. She writes short stories, she writes dream sequences. I'm also really interested in her whole other aspects of her life, which is as a travel writer. you could put together her travels, whether it's in America, Russia, Scandinavia, just as a few examples, and indeed through Western Europe in different periods, whether it's in 1920s or 30s. And she has this eye for detail, but she's always documenting, she's always recording things as she goes along. But she is also an editor and a publisher. She writes herself and she's extremely skilled at it, but she's always training and working up with other people. And as an editor, as a newspaper editor and a publisher, she's very interesting. She employs young women, for example, some young women journalists. During, in fact, in Dublin 1916, she sends a very, very young journalist to go and cover on the ground. She hires probably the first black journalist who's employed by a newspaper in Britain later on. So this is something that she does herself, but she also believes in that sort of ground up working editorially with other people. She has an artist's mind, but she has an economist's mind. She can do numbers and geopolitics, as for example, her analysis on the impact of the oil industry on the future of Middle Eastern politics in The Truth About the Oil Wars in 1922 shows. But all along, as a campaigning activist tool, she has this combination of setting out her vision for a better world. She always defines it. She's never vague. She's never inchoate. If she was writing utopian fiction, or if she was imagining another place, she defines it. She describes it. It has an architecture. It has content. It has policy. But she's also always critiquing at the same time what's going on around her and campaigning. And the other aspect of her writing is this constant battery of correspondence, whether it's to MPs, whether it's to politicians, letters to newspapers. And this travels across the entirety of her whole life. We can see her writing letters and correspondence as a youngster when she's doing it as a suffragette militant, right through to the 1930s, for example, when she's not the least writing to the Manchester Guardian, now the Guardian, on behalf of refugees against Nazism and fascism. And she conducts a campaign which is a two-pronged attack. She's writing to the Home Office, asking about why they will not, despite their claims that they will, allow Jewish refugees who are being persecuted and suffering anti-Semitism and trying to get refuge in Britain, why they will not allow either let people in or indeed give them leave to remain. But she triages that, because at the same time as writing to the Home Office and writing to MPs and government, she's also writing directly to the newspapers. People talk a lot about free speech and journalistic freedom at the moment, and rightly, but how many of us are prepared or to go to prison for it is perhaps another question. And it's always worth bearing in mind, in terms of the driving principles for Sylvia, that she was prosecuted not once but twice, in fact, on free speech issues, once in 1918 for sedition, and then in 1920, 1921, she served a further 6 months in Holloway, in solitary, for sticking up for the right of her journalists, for 3 younger male journalists to have published the articles they did in her newspaper. She wouldn't name them, even though there was a sedition trial. She refused to name them. She took the rap, and she went to prison for 6 months for that principle. She was an owner and editor and a printer of newspapers, which I think is a really, really extraordinary aspect of her, and really important for us to remember now, in terms of actually being able to own and control, and thinking of what the platforms are that we can do that from. In Sylvia's time, it was having a print newspaper. Maybe it's in ours. We've got to work out how we get hold of a satellite that can be a platform that we can use. But from her use at home, the first newspaper, in fact, was the Home News and Universal Mirror that she and her sisters did when they were young. And Sylvia used to write these actually very interesting walks around London, and her observations on various things, whether it was the tower, the portcullis gate at the Tower of London, or the Egyptian collection in the British Museum. Of course, she was a contributor to many newspapers, the Suffragette and Votes for Women during that period, but she developed and owned collectively with other people, the Women's Dreadnought, which was the newspaper of the East London Federation of Suffragettes. Sylvia, at the planning meeting, when they were all sitting around talking about what they wanted to call it, was keen to call it the Worker's Mate, because she felt that that was sort of gender neutral, and she liked the sound of it. But this was a time of militarism, and there you were in the docklands of London, and the other women in the Elves felt that it should be the Women's Dreadnought, so she quite rightly gave way to the collective will. And the Women's Dreadnought, of course, became the Workers' Dreadnought after the Bolshevik Revolution, appropriately. And moving on, Sylvia had the New Times and Ethiopian News, and that newspaper was in itself a campaigning tool that focused right from the beginning on the rise, warning about the rise of Mussolini and fascism at a time when the British establishment were whining and dining these people and praising Mussolini for making the trains run on time. And going forward from that, raising awareness, using this as a campaigning tool relentlessly to draw attention to Mussolini's colonialist, racist, imperialist war in Ethiopia, and saying that if anybody, if the world, if the West, if Britain, America, Europe gave way on that they would be next. And so the New Times and Ethiopian News, in which she wrote many interesting series, including a very, very long series on how to fight fascism, are really instrumental, and I think as a legacy instructive for us in terms of how to use these things as a tool. And then finally, at last in her life, a wonderful magazine, which was the Ethiopia Observer, which was during her final years when she was living in Ethiopia. And that was was history and a magazine of history and culture, and reminds us that Sylvia, somehow, if this doesn't all sound like she was writing quite a lot, and spare some sympathy for the biographer on that one, please. She wrote many books. She wrote huge books. She wrote a great big book on India. She wrote her own memoirs, The Suffragette Movement, followed by The Home Front, which was about the war years, followed by In the Red Twilight, which was succeeded that. And so she was someone who produced very many and large books, and indeed some others, always setting out her ideas for a better world. Save the Mothers, her blueprint for a national maternity service that would be accessible to all to deal with maternal and infant mortality. And in 1932, for example, her outline of the socialist scheme for national health and allied medical services, in which she designs and describes what she thinks something called a national health service might look like and be. She outlines her ideas for social Soviets in the Dreadnought, and I've already mentioned her what I think is a very important series to us now, How to Fight Fascism. This was a different age, and Sylvia was, as well as a great writer, an extraordinary writer, she was a very important orator, and oratory and speaking, as for all the women around her who she worked with, empowered, and who indeed empowered and informed her, was enormously important in a pre-digital world. This was not a world of television. This was not a world of radio. Broadcast came very late in her life. Public speaking and campaigning were incredibly important for most of her campaigning life. The ability to stand outdoors and take up space, not only as a socialist, not as someone demanding universal suffrage, but to take up space as a political woman, to be heard in public, to capture a crowd, withstand heckling. And these were real challenges for a young woman in doing this. I mean, there's a famous encounter in 1921. In this case, she was heckling because she was both speaker, she was an excellent speaker, but she was also an excellent heckler. She was a very good orator, but she was a very good questioner. So she could be on either side, the platform or in the audience. but her first encounter with Churchill when she's 21 is an incident where they have a very vocal exchange, which actually results in him physically assaulting her and having her temporarily detained by his Liberal Party thugs in a holding room off the stage, which she then is able to escape from with the help of a crowd who's gathered outside. They pull her through the window and they put out a soapbox for her, a chair, and she stands on it and delivers an impromptu speech, not to be shut up. So I think she was that rare person with a great command for language, which she loved, both writing but orally too. And I think if we pause and compare her to some of the so-called great men of the period, as who are prodigious writers and legendary orators, and Churchill's a good example, given that their careers shadowed each other and they had so much to do with each other throughout their lives. I can't imagine that he was terribly happy when he realised that when he became MP for Woodford that was where she lived and that she would be his most persistent constituent. But look at the difference between the way that they are remembered and celebrated. So the speaking woman who takes up the public space. I think the next skill to think about is Sylvia's activist skills as a lobbyist. She's an indefatigable lobbyist, an irritant of leaders, friendly and unfriendly, domestic and international. She's very good. She's very good at working with anybody. She's not of a mind that she's not. You'd never hear of Sylvia Pankhurst to say, "I don't have a friend in a certain political party or a friend of a certain class," or something like that. She's value driven, and if people are on the side for justice, if she thinks that she can make them allies, she will work, she will have dialogue, she will discuss as far as she can, and she makes sure that she networks and uses her friends, whether it's Keir Hardie, George Bernard Shaw, George Lansbury. She asks for help, and she asks them to use their platforms to enable her and to enable the people that she's working with, and to, whether it's tabling questions in Parliament, giving advice, and so on. And she's also very good at networking and doing that internationally. So she lobbies more broadly, including when she goes to the Soviet Union to the Congress to have conversation with Lenin to continue their conversation, which had started in Britain. So she lobbies first in the cause of universal suffrage and votes for women, not just posh women, but then in the broader socialist cause domestically and internationally. And as I mentioned, famously arguing with Lenin, who writes the tract Left-Wing Communism, an Infantile Disorder, in order to try and reason with her and try and win the argument. It's a mark of Sylvia's ability, if you like, to capture what we might call the top line or the soundbite, that when she sees Lenin's tract and she sees its very long title, Left-Wing Communism and Infantile Disorder, she dubs the tract, which is targeted at her and Gallagher, William Gallagher, left childishness, which I think is interesting and indicative, and she picks up on the incipient misogyny, perhaps, that is implied in her supposed infantile disorder. She's pro-peace in the First World War, but she's as an anti-fascist in the Second World War. She supports, of course, military intervention. And I think what's really significant is that we, as an activist, she's always driven by principles. She will, if circumstances change, if conditions change, if the threats change, she will reconsider. It is never her party, right or wrong. The Labour Party that she was part of the formation of, her parents were founder members of the ILP, the Independent Labour Party. Her great love, Keir Hardie, became its first leader. But she, when the Labour Party sold out over the First World War, she left. She came back sometime later, but she fundamentally believed that she's a Democrat. The ends do not justify the means if they are authoritarian. Autocracy is never acceptable. And in the organisation of her own organisations that she was part of as an organiser, and indeed in other ones that she joined, that aspect was very important. And she first split with the Family Party, the Women's Social and Political Union, was over this question of autocracy fundamentally, when her mother and her sister wanted to take the Women's Social and Political Union from being a democratically run and represented organisation into being an autocracy. And as Sylvia quite rightly said, if we can't do it ourselves in our own organisation, how can we fight for it? It's not logical and it's not right. So she uses every means at her disposal, but she is not averse to direct action. If persuasion, if these other tools will not work, she understands that the role and importance of direct action in a democratic context, and that there is not some false dichotomy between direct action and the possibility of democracy and parliamentary democracy. Indeed, as we know, and as she knew from her history going right back to the Chartists, and whether it was looking at the history of the Chartists and democratisation, whether it was the abolitionist movement in which she was steeped and brought up, and whether it was in the feminist movement, that nothing was ever won by asking nicely and knocking politely at the door of Westminster, and that the two things had to happen together, and that democracy doesn't happen every few years at a ballot box, which we should know very well at the moment, given the current incumbents of our own government and indeed in America and other places. Democracy has to be defended and organised every day in the communities and on the streets. And it's been put to me as Sylvia's biographer that there is something infantile or undemocratic or distracting about direct action and grassroots organising, some kind of implication that movements are not the place where democracy happens and is renewed the whole time. And this notion that she's some kind of student organiser or hothead couldn't be further from the truth. Organising for her was social and community services in extreme times, whether it was food, health, protection from draconian policing and interventions of the state and surveillance during the war, but equally understanding that you have to sometimes wedge your foot inside the door, and you use what you have. If you have education, if you have a middle class confidence, if you have ways of doing things, you stick your elbows out and you make use of the tools and means that are at your disposal. She understands the relationship between direct action in communities and on the streets and in workplaces and parliamentary process. They're not in tension with each other. And just to give a practical example of this, the one that some of you I think will know, but in 1914, when she's come out of prison, she's very weak. She's been force fed, and she's been hunger striking again, and she demands of the misogynist anti-women's vote Asquith of the Liberal Party that he meet a deputation of working women who are representatives and leaders with the East London Federation of Suffragettes. And the ask is simply that they be able to come and put their case for why they, as working women, would wish to have the vote an enfranchisement, and why their leadership and their leadership in their communities is also a way of expanding enfranchisement for everyone and leading it. Asquith repeatedly refuses, so Sylvia, having come out on this particular occasion, just says okay, and she asks people to lie her down on a stretcher next to Cromwell statue outside Parliament, and she gets Keir Hardie and a group of others to go in with a message for Asquith and say, either you will meet these women and listen to what they have to say, that's the ask, or I am going to lie down here and stay here until I die. If she hadn't threatened to die outside of Parliament, she hadn't taken that literally street level protest, with a principle of saying, this is a principle for which I am prepared to die, an act, if you like, of extreme martyrdom. Jane Savoy, amongst the other group of people, might not on that occasion have got the opportunity, as I say, with that foot in the door, to then go in, and as a consequence of that extreme action, that threat, the women's deputation went in and were able to put their eloquent case, presenting their working conditions, presenting the outline of their lives, and explaining to Asquith, who had never been in the presence of working women, let alone sat still long enough to listen to what they had to say, why and when and how, and what their demand for the vote and equality was. And after he had listened, Asquith said, "No, you put your case very reasonably and moderately." Now, we can all argue about what we think the word moderation means, but that is one example where you have street action, direct action to achieve parliamentary approach and dialogue. And there are many others. And I think if we think about where we move forward to where we are now, you know, let's just say, you know, a young Swedish school child who says with a group of friends, we're going to have a school strike on a Friday, because if we don't start doing this and protest about the need to save the planet, we're not going to have schools to go to. And the environmental movement making so much mobilization on the outside in the context of being re-energized through that and Extinction Rebellion, you know, they wouldn't have started listening quite so closely, or it wouldn't have tried to force things on the inside. Likewise, I think we can draw similar analogies with what's happening in terms of Black Lives Matter, which is the latest iteration of a long movement, a 500-600-year-old movement that began with the abolitionist movement and has moved through consistently to where we are now in its current iteration. Black Lives Matter is a long established, and, you know, comes out of a long and established anti-racist international movement for equality and justice. It is not a moment. It is not some people suddenly exploding and protesting on the streets. It has an internal coherence and a history, and we forget these things at our peril. So those were some of the key skills that I thought I would sort of suggest to pull out. There are others, but those are the core ones. And I think if we sort of step back and think, you know, what's the most important lesson to learn from Sylvia's life? She sticks to principles. She's driven by principles. You'll get some versions of her, some discussions, people say, oh, but she changed and she moved from this campaign to the next and she wasn't consistent. She was utterly consistent. The principles stay the same. The objectives stay the same. Of course, the campaigns and the political moments change, and that's what she changes through. But she believes in empowerment, both, you know, of herself by others and for others, and solidarity. Her father Richard said, in a very Victorian way, you might think, if you do not work for other people, you will not have been worth the upbringing. But he was a Victorian barrister, but he was also a socialist, and fundamentally delivered and instilled in them that idea of collective contribution. Later in her life in Ethiopia, a group of school children gave her a plaque, a little ceramic plaque, to thank her for visiting their school, where they had arranged a debate, where they put her into debate. She was quite an elderly lady at that time, in her 70s, and they were sort of youngsters up to sort of age 12, 14. And that plaque, which she treasured to the end of her life, read simply with one word: others. And I think that's a very that's an apt description to a woman who I discovered that, conversely to this, sometimes this sort of this unbearable harridan that she was sometimes portrayed as, because she spoke up, because she spoke truth to power, always. But she was actually very modest, and she was a listener when she was on the ground and when she was in her own community and doing her own work. So I think, you know, use the skills and power you have to facilitate others. That seems to be, and learn from it. That seems to be one of the key things you get coming through from Sylvia. Emphasis on community organisation, sharing resources to organise and promote and enable participation and voice for all of us who don't have access to state power, for others, for yourself. Self-sacrifice, martyrdom, in some senses, are not very fashionable, not very fashionable ideas, not very fashionable values or practices in a rampantly sort of, you know, capitalist individualistic universe that we live in. But that if you do not dedicate your life to serving others, you will not have been worth the upbringing, is perhaps just a different way of saying solidarity, community, and collectivism. And I think that this is so important now in the middle of this pandemic, which exaggerates and exploits every inequality on the planet. It was there before. It's not that it wasn't there before, but it throws it into starker relief. And I think that if you are only even vaguely of the left, a soft shade of pink, we still all have one job, and that is to amplify the voice of justice, the voice of many, the voice of collective, of working people, and enabling ourselves and others to have voice and give voice to that, and also to maintain values and principles that we do not. There is no democracy if the defence or the achievement of parliamentary democracy is meant to be won at any cost. That never worked before, and it's never going to work now. Thank you very much.
Stop it now. Thank you, Rachel. I hope you can hear me.
I can.
I had a little bit of trouble there with Smolder. Apologies for unstable internet connections tonight. There's something wrong with the internet. Apparently, I've been jumping around. Rachel was jumping around a bit. And also, we had a little problem with, I hope that didn't detract from what Rachel had to say to you. And Nigel, if you're still there, I would really like you to put up the picture of the last picture in the slides of the cafe in Addis Ababa, the Sylvia Pankhurst cafe. That didn't come up. I just thought that'd be really, really nice to see that, if we could see that now. Meanwhile, while Nigel's looking for that, I've got a couple of questions. Well, the first one from Graham. Currently, is there anywhere where you can see any of Sylvia's art?
Oh, that's fantastic. Did you say Graham?
Graham Peterson, yeah.
Yeah, no, Graham.
Yeah, Graham
that's
Peterson, yeah.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. If you mean in public galleries and so forth, last year the Tate acquired 4 paintings, beautiful paintings, one of which you saw in the presentation, which is the woman in the cotton mill. These were acquired by the Tate thanks to a generous donation of money, in fact, by a very successful businesswoman who is a Labour supporter. And these 4, there you go, that's it. And these 4 beautiful paintings, which are from Sylvia's northern tour, when she went around different factories and industries, living with, drawing, painting, and recording the working lives of working women around Britain. She went to the collieries. She followed the fisher lassies. She went to potato pickers and Berwick. She went to Wedgwood to see, you know, the production of the china and ceramics. And as you can see here, she went to the mills. She went to shoe factories. This is an extraordinary and unprecedented in British art project, and really, really sort of wonderful. And these 4 paintings, as I say, have been acquired by the Tate. Now, I believe they were supposed to be put on display, on permanent display within the Tate, and we can expect that to happen. I think that's been held up by the COVID-19 pandemic, but I understand that that is the intention. So that is one place where you will be able to see some part. The other thing is, very much strongly suggest, like, have a good old cruise around the internet. There's a fair amount you can find, and the other thing is, I discovered it's kind of funny story about my own research, but literally about 4 weeks before my book came out, that I'd been working on for about 10 years, the International Institute of Social History in Amsterdam made its archive of Sylvia's papers one of the projects that it invested with this amazing state-of-the-art digitization technology, which made it a lot more accessible. So if you plug into it, you can actually find quite a bit of her stuff there. And the other places, I think a couple of the images you've seen in the presentation this evening are in the National Portrait Gallery. I think at least one of those self-portraits. There is an out of print but really, really good book that her son Richard Pankhurst did, Sylvia Pankhurst, Artist and Crusader, and you can find that secondhand. And there's some really wonderful images in there, and it shows things like, for example, when she won a scholarship. She was so good, she won a scholarship to Venice, and she went and she did all these paintings in Venice when she was a youngster before she became an activist. So I hope that's a few places you can look, but I agree with you, there needs to be a great big art book and something that also captures some of those installations and the festivals that she did. A few of them are in my book, but not many.
That was the next question. There's a question from Caroline Beatty. It says that, are any of these images in the slides in your book?
Yes. I don't suppose as much. Yes, there are quite. So I don't know if. So some of these. This is like. So some of these you've seen the women, the membership card for the Women's Social and Political Union she designed. The poster for Keir Hardie to support the Working Men's Bill, but you know that there, if you can see that, that's from the installation that Princess Skating Ring, and it's that was huge. I mean, that was absolutely massive. So she was very much like William Blake in that regard. She wanted to make great big and did for some of these festivals in great big public installations of public art that people could sort of be immersed in or would be outdoors. Very much like Blake in that regard.
Our next question then, could about our anti-racism and opposition to empire, which contrasts to the failure of many of those who, like her, support the Communist International to take as a principled position as she does. That's from Jeff. A bit more about our anti-racism and opposition to empire as a contrast to her support of the Communist International.
Sorry, Les, I didn't quite hear the part of the question. Could you repeat it?
Could you say a little more about her anti-racism and opposition to empire?
Oh yeah, sure. Well, what I can say is that it's in the book, and it's a very, very dominant, absolutely dominant theme of the book. But as it is a dominant theme of her life, her parents were abolitionists. There were abolitionists, American abolitionists, who came to stay in their home, and indeed those anti-racist campaigners were organisers were people who spoke up for the women's movement as well, both in America and in Britain. So there was a very formative dialogue between them. So I think it's important to remember that this is something, and indeed some of those techniques of cultural boycotts, of product boycotts, of iconography of things to organize campaigns to bring awareness began in the abolitionist movement before they did in any, that they inspired many that came after them. For Sylvia, that is consistent and moves right through to the fact that anti-racism is, I don't think she has a hierarchy of inequalities. I think she's very much of the belief that nobody's free unless everybody is free, and her engagement in Ethiopia as part of her internationalism, because of course Ethiopia was the heart of the African Renaissance. It was the world hub of rising African consciousness, whether that for the colonial decolonization movements, whether it was sub-Saharan Africa. Indeed, she was involved in the, there it is. So that's,
there it is.
That's the Sylvia Pankhurst Cafe, and that is her name. That says the Sylvia Pankhurst Cafe in Amharic. And that is on Sylvia Pankhurst Street, which you can see there at dusk, and that's at in the near centre of Addis Ababa. And those are photographs I took there. That's her grave, and her son Richard, as you can see there. She was given a patriot's grave because of her contribution to the fight against Mussolini's fascism. And indeed, that was the end of that's where my book ends. So I'm sure I don't feel that that's I think that's a very short form answer, but it is something that I explore in detail and in depth across the book from its beginning to its end. And indeed, in terms of her anti-racism and her participation in decolonization and anti-imperialist movements, it's important to remember that she, the fight for specifically for the women's vote was over sort of between 1918 and 28, but certainly for Sylvia, that part of it was over by 1918. She lived until 1960. And as you can probably tell, she didn't have very many days off. And those issues, that struggle was absolutely at the heart of what she did for the remainder of her life for over 3 decades.
Okay, we've got a question from "Was an incredible woman. Why do you think she was overlooked?"
Well, partly the answer's in the question, in the woman bit. We're still not very good, and when I say we, I'm thinking in this context specifically in terms of British history. I don't think we're still very good at having a good enough continuity and awareness and knowledge of our significant women political figures. I think that Sylvia Pankhurst, whatever your political persuasion, is unarguably one of the greatest women political figures of Britain in the 20th century. I think it's partly to do with the fact that she's a woman, but more than that, you see, if you're an aristocrat or you're a monarch, it does seem to help in terms of popular memory and being remembered. And those, I think that one of the other reasons she's not remembered is because she's a socialist. She's a socialist throughout her life. She's left-wing and she's communist for a period of her life, sometimes the big C, sometimes with a small c, call it what you will. But I think that from the 1970s onwards, when you have this move, particularly the 1980s and 90s, the telling of history becomes a very right-wing occupation. And I think that we live in a moment now where there has been unimaginably, well, no, not unimaginably, appallingly, there's been this flattening out, there's been this erasure of a very long, a very, very long history, people's history, that goes back much further and through to the present day, and that has been under erasure with this sort of right-wing version of history within the writing of feminist history as well, by the way, not just more broadly of women figures or political figures, and that from within that affects the education system. It affects just broad, general books that are available and what's invested in and what's published. So because she's a woman, and because she's left-wing, and because she's a socialist, and because she believes in equality for all, and because she speaks truth to power, and because she doesn't think that it's the Labour Party right or wrong, and that's probably enough reasons to get started on.
I think there's a whole load of reasons there. That's a great load of reasons. Can I, just to pick something up from that last point you made there, would you like to say something about her dealings with Harry, the British communist, in the London docks? Because that was quite a good example of her organising, wasn't it?
Sorry, Les, I didn't quite get that. Were you talking the?
No, I was talking
Did you
about
say Harry Pollitt
and the dock. Pollitt, yeah.
The dock workers' strikes.
Because Sylvia was involved in that, wasn't she?
Yeah, no, that's yes, yes. I mean, what again? That's something that I describe and I talk about in my book. And indeed, I suppose just to give one example from that, the sedition imprisonment, prosecution and imprisonment for 6 months that she served was rooted, in short, in the fact that dockers were refusing to load munitions that the government were deploying to go to send over to Russia to help the White Russians against the Bolsheviks. And Sylvia set up PRIB, the People's Russian Information Bureau, but the Hands Off Russia campaign, something that she was involved in, and this origins. And I think the how can I put it? The unionization and the radicalization of not so much the dockers, because they always were, but also actually amongst the sailors. The sailors' strikes were really, really important because there's been a long time since there'd been trade union organization below decks. And in terms of that, Les, there is a chapter devoted, and I think it's called, where has it gone? Discontent on the Lower Deck. That's the one you need to read.
Then last but by no means least, I just wonder if you'd like to say a bit more about her relationship with Keir Hardie.
Well, she loved him and he loved her. And I think that, again, that is something that I've tried, that I do make central in the book. And what I would say about that is that at the beginning, you were kind enough to mention my last book, about Eleanor Marx, who I believe is in the continuity of the history that we need to have, the socialist feminist who precedes Sylvia and who indeed passes the baton to her. And there was a moment where they met, and that was a very important inspiration for me to decide that it was now time that I should follow Sylvia and try and tell her story. For this moment, was that when she was a young teenager, well, she was 12, I think, 12 or 13, she was taken by her father, Richard Pankhurst, to a meeting which was being held at the Mosley Hotel in Manchester in honour of William Liebknecht, the leader of the SPD, the German socialists. And at this meeting, Eleanor Marx, the elder gas workers union organizer, socialist feminist, by then very well known and also part of the early organization of the ILP, was speaking. And Sylvia was immensely impressed by this elder woman. But it's interesting that in her memory of the account when she writes it, she also remembers being very unimpressed by Edward Aveling, who was Eleanor Marx's partner, who was with her. And the reason that I mention this is because Eleanor Marx was hobbled and hampered ultimately as a woman of her time by that relationship. She couldn't escape it, and in the end it did for her. He did for her. And when you ask about Keir Hardie and the relationship with Sylvia, I think one of the things that is so helpful to us in terms of thinking about freedom for men and women within all the constraints of society is that Sylvia has a very different outcome. She has the same politics, the same organizing, but unlike Eleanor Marx, her personal life, her ability to follow her heart, her belief in free love, and living in a different way plays out very differently. She doesn't die from it. I think that what's very interesting for me about the relationship with Keir Hardie, is that you can see in a way he's under much more constraint than she is, and that is quite sad and hard to see. He can't escape the circumstances of his time, but that I think there's a fantastic one thing I would like to say about the relationship, Les, is that, I mean, like sometimes I've had people say, oh, but you know, he was 20 years older than her, which by the way was the age difference between Emmeline Pankhurst and Richard Pankhurst, her parents, but nobody mentions that about the great Emmeline Pankhurst, the leader of the movement. But she was 20 years younger than Richard, thank you very much, and that was not unusual at the time. And people say, oh well, you know, Hardie was so much older than Sylvia and this and that. And what's really interesting about tracking their relationship is how much he learned from her, how much he was inspired by her, and how she stood up to him. I mean, there's a particular episode I referred you to in the book. I mean, I tell you about all the lovely stuff, and you know, the walks and Kent and
buy the book.
well, no, all I'm saying is, like, you know, the love letters and all that, you know, that the love story is there, of course, yeah. But there is this particular moment where they have an argument, and it really is over the question of women's vote and the universal vote, and they walk along the river, and they have this argument, and she's younger than him, you know, by far, whatever, and she's like, well, no, sorry, I can't agree with you, and she walks off. There's never any time when she sort of does the younger girl ingenue little me thing. She stands up to him and has the argument, and the dynamics of that relationship and her decision, it's her decision to leave it in the end. He doesn't want it to end, but she knows that as he's never going to leave his wife Lily, and as time is moving on, she's never going to get what she wants, and she moves on. And I think that's a mark of her modernity and how that plays out.
Thank you very much. And now I think we must move on. I'll just end with great questions. This is from Sarah Jane Albury. Great questions. Thanks to everyone who posed them, and there was fascinating, illuminating answers. Isn't that a great? Thank you very much. Fascinating, illuminating. I'm going to invite Nigel back in. Thank you very much, Rachel, for speaking to us tonight. I found that totally illuminating. I hope everyone buy the book. I'm sure they are. You'll see a sudden spurt in book sales. And Nigel's now going to make a very brief advert for the rest of the Radical History School program throughout the winter. The first time we've done a winter program. So this is quite exciting. Right, Nigel, over to you.
Well, thank you, Rachel. I thought that was really interesting. I hope I didn't confuse the slides too much. There's a lot of images and a lot more in the book. Yes. So yes, thank you, Les. We've got a program running throughout the winter and into the new year. We've sort of pitched them on the second Tuesday of each month, so monthly. So next month, I think a controversial subject, or maybe just generally controversial. We've got Andrew Adonis, Lord Adonis, speaking about his book on Ernest Bevin, which he has called Labour's Churchill. Of course, Ernie Bevin was a West Country lad who became a radical campaigner in Bristol before he actually became a trade union official, and then became the father of the Transport and General Workers Union, and then, of course, Minister for Labour, Foreign Secretary. With all his flaws, and there certainly are a few, which I think we will hear about, he was a giant of the Labour movement in the 20th century that deserves more attention and more discussion and more consideration. And we're delighted that Frances O'Grady, the TUC General Secretary, is going to grill him. They're going to have a conversation about the book, and I know she won't hold back in terms of making the case for Ernie Bevin's triumphs and his weaknesses. We've got other sessions. We're going to be, well, we'll put up the program on the Tolpuddle website as it comes. We've got a few already in the frame for next year, so we will list them shortly. But I think that'll be the 10th of November, 7 till 8, on Zoom and social media, if we can
other channels. Other channels. I've got a lot of chat here. I don't know if you can see it, Rachel. People saying they're going to go out and buy your book and thanking you for a really great talk. And I'd just like to end with saying thank you very much for giving us your time so freely, for being so entertaining and illuminating. I'm really looking forward to reading the book myself. So I'm sure lots and lots of people will go out and buy this book tonight. And we look forward to seeing you in the future, hopefully in a tent in Tolpuddle in the freezing rain. And I'm sure you'll be great there too.
Okay, and thank you everyone for turning out for Sylvia. Thank you very much.